Me and probably many of you used to hate Shinji Ikari. To say that he earned a bad reputation among fans after the end of Evangelion would be an understatement. I know this because that was my own immediate reaction after watching the film all those years ago. We called him weak, annoying, pathetic, coward, and selfish. Shinji was already an unlikely protagonist from the start. A 14-year-old boy given an impossible task and expected against all odds to succeed. But unlike other strong, valiant, and stoic heroes in grand stories about saving the world, Shinji feels real. He reacts exactly as a teenager his age would in such a situation. Throughout the series, despite its sci-fi setting, Shinji Ikari's character arc remains believable and even endearing. We see him start out hesitant and afraid, but gradually moving forward, often stumbling, always uncertain about how to connect with others or confront his own insecurities. He was never meant to become a traditional hero, that was never the point, but he does grow in a very human way. So, why the hate? Not from everyone, of course, but from a noticeable part of the fandom. When you really think about it, that resentment didn't begin with the series, it began after the end of Evangelion. The film, which replaces episodes 25 and 26 of the series, to deliver a more specific ending to the story, has often been described as an emotional roller coaster for both the characters and the audience. Every disturbing aspect of these characters, every dark and uncomfortable theme that had previously lingered in the shadows throughout the series, now emerges here in full force. Everything here feels more visceral, more stylized, and intense, thanks to the bigger budget and the cinematic ambition that comes with a theatrical release. Yet, despite all these changes, the continuity is remarkably intact. It really does feel like just another episode, one where the stakes are higher than ever. Yes, everything looks, feels, and even sounds the same except for one thing, a crucial one: the protagonist. Shinji Ikari acts so differently in this film that I'd argue he's not even the same character anymore. His behavior here doesn't just show regression, in some ways it directly contradicts some aspect we learned about him across the original 24 episodes. There have been plenty of explanations for why this happened. Some well-meaning fans defend it with the usual, "What do you expect from a 14-year-old boy?" or "He's depressed and pushed to the edge." Others argue that Hideaki Anno, the creator of the series, was satisfied with the show's original ending, and that the only reason End of Evangelion even exists is because angry fans basically bullied him into making a real ending for the story. According to this view, he wrote this film as an intentionally FU to the audience, because they force him to redo something he already considered closed and finished. Personally, I don't buy that for a second. I believe Anno would have made this movie anyway, that it was always part of his vision. It's not as if he had a long list of other projects waiting, and given that he's done little else besides Evangelion to this day, I think it's fair to say that when the series ended, he simply wasn't ready to let go of this story. And maybe, despite what he says, he still is. So, if you're wondering, there's actually a simple explanation for Shinji's constant missteps and horrible decisions throughout the movie. End of Evangelion exists for one reason and one reason only: to finally show us the long-teased human instrumentality project. Yes, you can't spend an entire series building up that concept and then not show it at all, ever. The problem comes with the realization that the instrumentality can only happen if humanity fails. It's a defeat scenario, completely apocalyptic in every sense of the word. It's like if Sauron got the ring back, or if the Sith wiped out every Jedi, or if Thanos actually won and all the heroes are gone for good. Not exactly the most hopeful story that can be told. Neon Genesis Evangelion had always been a story where the characters triumphed against all odds, often at the last second, through desperate acts that somehow resulted in success, as if it were one miracles after the other. But now, with no more angels left to fight, and when the last enemy of humanity is itself, there is no victory to be found, no miracle waiting at the end. The story of Evangelion can only culminate in humanity's failure, otherwise the instrumentality wouldn't even occur. And without that, there's no story left to tell. But this isn't a George R.R. Martin situation. Anno didn't write himself into a corner. This was always the plan all along, and he did finish his story as intended. I just think he didn't realize the compromises his story demanded, or maybe he just didn't care. For human instrumentality to occur, everything has to fail. And in the end, everything does fail. If the heroes had achieved even the slightest success, instrumentality would have been prevented. And that's precisely the problem. This event is the entire reason the movie exists. So Anno had to design a story where every attempt ended in failure. Every character collapsed under the weight of their own struggle. Asuka gets a brief moment of triumph, a flash of self-realization, only to be completely overwhelmed and brutally killed. Misato, with the angels gone, tries to follow Kaji's path and unravel the mysteries of Nerve, only to end up just like him. Ritsuko plans to go out in a blaze of rebellion, but instead, she's betrayed and murdered. Fuyutsuki and the rest of the Nerve staff can only watch helplessly as everything falls apart. And even Gendo, the mastermind, after years of meticulous planning, didn't achieve his goal in the end. And then we have Shinji Ikari, the main character, and the key that decides whether these events even happen at all. Anno needed Shinji to do literally nothing during the first half of the movie. The whole story depends on this boy not doing what he should. Anno keeps him paralyzed, depressed, hesitant, and mentally unstable, whatever it takes to keep him ineffective. From what we know from him until this point, you can say those traits fit his personality, but in this film they're pushed to an extreme that actually contradicts his earlier growth as a character. Doesn't feel natural or justified. I mean, even in the very first episode, despite all his completely justified fears and doubts, Shinji gets in the giant robot. He acts. But now, after everything he's been through, he suddenly needs to be dragged into the EVA. Let's examine this. In the beginning of the movie, Shinji finds himself standing before the flooded ruins of Tokyo 3. It seems to be the morning after the night he spent here, grieving the death of Kaworu, the one person who actually showed him genuine and selfless care and affection. And now he is once again alone and hopeless. Unable to face Rei after learning the truth about her and trusting Misato less and less, Shinji seeks out the only person he still considers safe, someone he might talk to like a normal human being. But to his disappointment, Asuka is unconscious, and his awkward attempts to wake her up are useless. At this moment, he seems so desperate for a trace of normalcy that even her usual rudeness and insults would have comforted him. But in his loneliness, he crosses a line, and then comes that infamous scene. This moment is the first major contradiction in the character we've come to know over the previous 24 episodes. Up to this point, Shinji has never been driven by his sexual impulses. Yes, he's a teenager and he's certainly experienced moments of natural arousal, but he never acts on them. And the only instance in which he does decide to do so, he reconsiders and stops himself. This aspect has never been crucial to who he was. Shinji's defining struggle has always been emotional, not physical. He's a depressed boy burdened with an immense responsibility, but his trauma is abandonment. And that trauma shapes every relationship he has and every choice he makes. Shinji has never been, nor has he ever fit, the archetype of the typical horny anime protagonist. If you remember, this situation has actually happened before, and that moment ended in nothing more than awkward silence. In episode 10, despite what he overhears through the fence, he never goes looking for a peephole to peek through. In episode 9, when Asuka is unknowingly exposing herself, Shinji, though clearly aware of it, deliberately looks her in the eyes instead. Say what you will about Shinji, but up until this point, everything suggests he's a well-behaved, decent boy, far more so than most anime protagonists of that era. And there is nothing that makes me think otherwise. That's why I genuinely believe this entire scene and the lead-up to it feel poorly conceived and artificially imposed. The most common explanation, or should I say justification, I've heard is that some people in moments of extreme stress or grief might act out in strange, almost primitive ways, seeking comfort through impulsive behavior. and that this is how Shinji felt after killing Kaworu. It's not a bad justification, but there's no real emotional or psychological buildup that supports it. The last time we saw Shinji, he wasn't frenzied or desperate. He was sad, melancholic, maybe even disillusioned, not just because he killed Kaworu, but because he's beginning to question everything. After spending so much time fighting the angels and then briefly living alongside one, his mind is now filled with conflicting thoughts. Was everything he did truly right? Was humanity really the victim in this war? Was it even worth saving in the first place? That's an angle I personally find far more interesting, and it ties quite nicely to the moment in which Shinji dooms humanity out of spite. Yet neither the series nor the movie ever fully explores this route, instead favoring a more emotionally dramatic payoff. The reason, or perhaps the necessity, to include that scene is quite simple. Anno needed to introduce a destructive element into Shinji's character, a wrecking ball to erase any trace of sympathy or empathy the audience might have for the protagonist and to prepare us for what is coming. Don't forget, the ultimate goal is failure, or we won't have this. After what happens, Shinji sees himself as the lowest of the low, can't even stand to look at himself in the mirror, and that's what drives his total reluctance to act for the rest of the movie. Which brings us to the next point, the reluctant protagonist. This part is especially frustrating for the viewer because even though the Shinji ran away again has become a meme, it actually doesn't happen that often. In fact, it really only happens once in episode 4. In episode 19, after feeling betrayed by his father, Shinji decides to leave, but he leaves with his head held high. That's not cowardice, that's conviction, so it doesn't count. But here, in End of Evangelion, he doesn't even run, he just collapses. He chooses to stay in the shadows and die. All of Nerve is under attack, people are dying all around him, and he doesn't move. Even with a gun to his head, he doesn't speak. Comes sweet death, I suppose. This hollow, defeated boy has nothing to do with the Shinji who once climbed and piloted a literal monster to save everyone. Terrified, yes, but determined. Now, the author has decided that the protagonist must be completely ineffective, not because that's who he is, but because the story demands it, and again, that feels so artificial. In the end, as we all know, all of this is irrelevant because this is the finale. And one way or another, the boy will end up inside the Eva. None of the obstacles and sacrifices really matter in the end because the author has a plan B for everything to fail exactly as he wants. If you've been paying attention, you'll know that Seal had already chosen Unit 01 as the catalyst for the Human Instrumentality Project instead of Lilith. So this means... That's right. Shinji never truly had the opportunity to do anything at all. Even if he had been motivated, decisive, and ready to act from the very beginning, he could not have saved or prevented anything. The moment he activates Unit 01, the ritual begins and the Eva becomes paralyzed. The end is set in motion. The mass-produced Evas were likely toying with Asuka, simply buying time until Unit 1 was activated. So, if you were lamenting that Shinji wasn't ready in time, the question becomes, in time for what, exactly? Everything was inevitable. Within the structure Anno has built for this movie, the protagonist's choices and actions are rendered meaningless from the start. This marks another key difference in the character. In the series, the protagonist drove the story forward. His actions or inactions set everything in motion. But in the film, it's the events that drive him, as if he were a leaf caught in the wind, making him more of a passive subject of circumstances than an active participant. But Anno isn't done. The pieces are all in place, but to make everything collapse, one final betrayal is still missing, the complete downfall of the protagonist. You see, fandoms love shipping, they always do. Whenever there's even a hint of a love triangle, the debates start. Who will the main character end up with? Evangelion occasionally flirts with that idea, but given the character's age and Shinji's own indecision, you'd expect it to remain ambiguous and honestly irrelevant. But no. To everyone's surprise, in this film, Shinji does choose someone. He chooses Asuka. Yes, clumsy, desperate, and emotionally broken, he reaches out to her. Although I believe his feelings for her are genuine. In this moment, he's reaching out to her, more out of a need for something to hold on to than out of love. Maybe in his mind, finding love means the world is still worth saving. Or maybe he's just looking for an excuse to keep things the way they are, now that he has been put in the unique position of redefining existence itself. Whatever his reasons were, his efforts ended in rejection, and here's the key. Both Asuka and the viewer understand why. She knows he isn't really choosing her. He's merely settling for her. She herself is another tormented soul who desperately needs true love in her life, and she isn't falling for this charade. She refuses to be his excuse for existing. Faced with that rejection, Shinji completely unravels and his clumsy pleas turn into violence. What follows marks the exact point where the Shinji of the series and the Shinji of the movie become two different people. Strangling someone isn't a tantrum. It's an act of violence with intent to kill. Are we really supposed to believe that the same boy who was once willing to die rather than risk hurting another human being now decides to literally kill someone he loves, just because he didn't get what he wanted from her? This has always been a story about a boy not getting what he wants out of life and dealing with it, so why would it be different now? The Shinji who once embodied silent pain and vulnerability becomes vengeful, cruel, and empty. This transformation isn't earned, it's imposed and is completely artificial. But Anno knew he needed one last despicable and destructive moment for the character to justify what comes next. Out of spite and self-hatred, Shinji no longer sees value in individual life. Humanity collapses, instrumentality begins, and the author gets the ending he wanted. So congratulations, Anno, you got your apocalypse. And it was cheap. Only cost you one character. You may think that I hate this movie, but it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it is my favorite Evangelion content ever created, which is why I always come back to it after so many years. What frustrates me is when an author reshape a well-established character to make their story work, instead of building the story and ending around how that character, as originally established, would naturally act. It's disappointing every time it occurs, across literature, television, film, and video games. Characters who were once sharp and cautious suddenly become gullible and careless. Brilliant strategists and manipulators turn into outright morons. And there's never a good reason for it, just another case of the writer bending logic to make the story work. I have to admit that the End of Evangelion isn't the worst case of this by far. I may hold Evangelion in such high esteem that I wish to think it should be above this trope when clearly it is not. So yes, the End of Evangelion frustrates me. Shinji's character is bent to the point of breaking just to serve the story, and that hurts because he was always an endearing and real character, worthy of every minute invested in his journey. I can imagine many other ways to tell this same story without necessarily having to mop the floor with the protagonist. Or, even worse, essentially writing a new character with all the traits and tendencies of the previous one but exaggerated for the worse, ignoring all growth and having a poor justification for all of it. And yet, even with all its flaws, or what I perceive as flaws, the movie still resonates with me like almost no other story can. It's raw, terrifying, and brilliant. It forces you to confront failure, despair, and the weight of human emotions in a way that few stories dare and succeed at. Anyway, thanks for listening.